What? I think that we're going to assume some sort of a power failure in World of Laura, and so I'm just going to turn it right over to you, Brandon Crilly, and by the time you are done, I will have some bio information pulled up to be able to fully introduce you
It sounds
after
good.
your reading instead of before. And so let's rock. The floor is yours.
Rock and roll. Yeah, so I introduced myself a little bit too. So hi, everybody out there in Facebook and elsewhere. So I'm Brandon Crilly. I'm here in Ottawa, Canada, where it is dark and stormy right now. But thankfully no power outage, so we're doing okay. I'm a science fiction fantasy author as well as a games writer. I do a bunch of short fiction, and a debut novel come out in 2022 with a sequel on the way. And as I was telling these folks, I'm also one of the organizers for CanCon, which is Ottawa's local science fiction, fantasy, and horror conference, which happens in October or November, depending on the year. So I wear a whole lot of different hats all the time, which can get really tiring, but keeps me busy. And there's probably more official stuff that I've forgotten that's in my bio. But yeah, so my the story that I'm going to read for you folks tonight is I feel like authors say this all the time, like saying it's one of my favorite stories, but it's genuinely one of my favorite stories that I've had published. So it came out last year in Utopia Science Fiction magazine, which if you haven't heard of it, is a magazine that publishes exclusively climate fiction and solar punk and that sort of stuff. And a lot of my short fiction over the past few years has been climate fiction of some stripe, either like very much climate fiction or kind of sci-fi stuff in the background. As I was very excited when they published it last year. Yeah, the story Seeds for Titanium, which may or may not be appearing in an anthology this year that I can't talk about because I was sworn to secrecy. But it's going to come out later this year in a book that may or may not have the word best in the title. It's just but officially, I said nothing. So, Catherine, your reaction?
Intriguing.
Anyway, so yeah, so Seeds for Titanium is the story. Science fiction. It's kind of like a science fantasy sort of piece, which you'll see as I get into it. And yeah, without further ado, I'm going to dive in. So this is Seeds for Titanium. That first time I found the tree folk, I followed the trail of sap. More spills than you might think in the guts of a low market. Fuel dribbles sometimes from the thruster pods, tiny leaks from a coolant pipe slated for replacement, rat piss. Those sticky splotches leading around Conduit 7 looked like blood at first, except darker and thicker. It smelled like sweets instead of iron, though. I guess I was sort of following blood. The floor is mostly grading in those maintenance sections, but the sap didn't leak through much. I tried not to think about little flecks turning rock hard on the pipes and cables underneath. No way the scrubbers could polish that away. Something scratched up the bulkhead in places too, which would have solved my dilemma about calling security if it weren't for the leaves all around the crawl space entrance. Curled and bright green, but already shriveling when I picked one up. Never saw something grown break apart that quickly. When I turned up my Palm's nanos, the being inside the crawl space shuffled toward the light, not away like I expected. Knew what it was, even though I'd only seen them on my link. They say tree folk are huge, but this one couldn't have been much more than 7 feet, all hunched over, so it looked more like a bundle of twigs and branches than a being. Okay, you could argue that's kind of what tree folk are, I guess. Couple larger pools of sap right near it. Saw some dripping from cuts on its limbs, and the tree folks trembling the whole time, making this soft rustling sound from its leaves rubbing together. Security should have dealt with it, earned the hefty budget that UN sets aside for their equipment, even though there'd been no issues on my low market in years. Except you ever imagine a drone trying to talk to a tree? Didn't work out so well on the surface when the tree folk first showed themselves, from what I remember. So, against all kinds of better judgment, I stuck my hand out and let the nanos brighten a touch more. Doesn't look too comfy in there. You want to come out where there's a little more space? It took repeating that a couple of different ways before the tree folk moved. At the time, I didn't know why it changed its mind about trusting me. I was more concerned with how it moved a lot quicker than I expected, crawling branch over branch until it sort of flowed out into the corridor. The mess of vines and leaves on top pressed against the ceiling, and its limbs practically touched both walls. When it stepped forward, one of its three legs buckled, but it held steady as a bunch more leaves dropped onto the grating. With a better look, I counted at least a dozen nicks and cuts across its trunk and front branches, some charred around the edges. Looked like it picked a fight with a magna cutter and lost in the second round. There, roomier. I couldn't find a face anywhere on its bark, so I just focused on its center of mass. Don't suppose you can tell me how you ended up here? Meaning the low market, not the crawl space. Far as I'd heard, no tree folk ever left the surface. Too much work to do down there, helping grow the non-sentient trees and keep them balanced with Earth's towns and whatnot. Didn't matter what I meant, though, since on that first meeting, the tree folk wouldn't talk to me. Took another minute of me staring, and the tree folk probably staring back, before I decided what to do and brought it to the observation deck. My thinking was trees like sunlight. Tree folk couldn't be much different, especially the way this one leaned into the glow from my palm. Never heard of tree folk getting violent, and this one wasn't menacing or anything other than its size, but I didn't like being in close quarters with something strong enough to lift a truck struck in the gorge. We took the maintenance corridors where the tree folk would fit. The concourses on B through D deck were bigger but full of station crews and vendors, either from other orbitals or the surface. Used crew-only hatches all the way to the observation deck and stepped out into this huge space full of people. Most had conversations to focus on, nanos to regenerate, or the big observation viewport to stare out, but didn't take long for someone to notice me coaxing the tree folk further into the open. Pretty soon I had a wide berth of whispering figures and a bunch of vids streaming through people's links. I found a couple later online. I looked more worried about the attention than my new friend did. The tree folk wasn't keen on following until it spotted the agribase. Then it was me keeping up with its longer legs, even with the hitch in its step until its feet sunk into the agribase's soil. Ours was bigger than most, about 40 meters squared, leading right up to the viewport, but anyone lounging on the clover there or leaning against a tree scattered, leaving me and the tree folk on our own. Didn't seem too interested in the people. Minus an obvious face, I guessed it was looking at the viewport, so I started explaining the ring of solar collectors outside. The matter energy converters needed more juice back then, but still not as much as the collectors could catch, so they reflected some onto the observation deck. Fed the agribase's plants and let people charge their nanos. While I rambled, mine pulsed purple on the back of my hands. The tree folk pointed at them with the end of a branch. Oh yeah, they're programmed to charge any chance they get. And then from behind me, that thing isn't safe. These four folks in freighter jackets stood in front of the crowd. Closest was a stocky guy, a little younger than me. Okay, probably a decade or two younger, with that captain you see, that captain swagger that you see in some folks. Vendors have that sometimes too, you might have noticed. Emblem of a seahorse on their jackets, probably unique to their company, and pointing these ugly looks over my head. The tree folk sucked its roots from the soil and stood behind me. Remember the height difference here. Haven't you heard what their kind have done? Freighter Mine said, pointing at the tree folk. I hadn't, beyond what I mentioned earlier. My link preferences were hard-coded to technical updates, new jerry-rigging vids, history docudramas. There was a new one out that week about finishing Africa's Great Green Wall, I think. Doesn't seem to be making much trouble, I said. Not right now, maybe. It caused enough damage on our ship. That's so. Yeah, that is so, Freighterman sneered. Caught that thing's roots worming toward our solar panels after it snuck on board. That bark can be hard as diamonds if it wants. Then it attacked us when we found it. The crowd murmured when I looked back at the tree folk, at those magna cutter wounds in its trunk, and the way it had started trembling again. Diamonds, eh? Huh, you must have been lucky then, I said, since none of them sported so much as a bruise. Freighterman caught on pretty quick. That thing needs to pay. I doubt it can make a transfer right now. Then maybe someone else should, one of the others said, tapping the multi-tool on her belt, for getting in our way. Crossing my arms and shrugging didn't earn me any points with them. Maybe they thought a low-market maintenance man couldn't handle a scuffle. Let it be known that working somewhere without much in the way of issues doesn't mean I've never had to handle myself. Let it also be known that doesn't mean a scuffle is my preference. If you want to make things messy, I'm sure it'll look great on the feed. Freighterman glanced at the crowd and the number of eyes shining with active link uploads, and at the security unit standing in back, all titanium casing and a blinking uplink to my favorite operator in the control room who doesn't have any patience for riffraff. I might have pinged security while Freighterman said his piece. The one with the multi-tool went white and he waved her to back down. I warned you, Freighter Man said to me. That thing isn't safe. Yeah, good talk. He didn't seem to like that, but I didn't care so much. As he and his lackeys wandered away, I gave security a wave. Thanks, Alice. I think I'm good here. The tree folk stopped trembling once the freighter crew left the deck. I held out one of my palms, but didn't get too close, not because of what Freighter Man said, but because some people would rather not be touched when they're scared. When it extended a branch, I gave the rough bark a pat, which didn't seem too personal. You stay here as long as you like. I'll make sure security leaves you be. Second time I saw the tree folk, it wasn't so scared. Working maintenance on one low orbit market is probably the same as any other. I'm just old enough to remember when matter energy converters were new. That was a big year. Things still fit together weird sometimes, patch jobs to avoid needing a replacement part. I could go on. Point is that since my market was built by a modern converter, my job involved monitoring and requisitioning more than anything else. But on an orbital the size of a small surface town, there's a reason I didn't see the tree folk again for a while. Meanwhile, my buddy made itself a home. Didn't surprise me when the tree folk set down temporary roots, needed to heal enough to head home, right? Except nothing on my link told me how long that might take, but I did read up some on, let's call it Tree Folk 101. You probably know the important stuff, given that thing in your pocket. Found a vid from when they first identified themselves back in 2120 or so, another on how they were working on expanding the old growth forests down on the surface and actually using our tech to do it sometimes. Read about that tension with the UN, figured Freighter Man was angry about the urban land they gave up after the tree folk sort of just grew into it. Meanwhile, I stopped thinking about our local resident until someone mentioned offhand in the same tone as the fava bean roaster on C deck that apparently it hadn't left. I spotted my buddy from the entrance hatch. Not because the observation deck was any less busy, the tree folk stood about 10 feet tall now. Station crew barely glanced at it, but the vendors pointed and whispered, taking stills with their links. When the tree folk's trunk shifted, someone in a Dead Sea conglomerate uniform backed away so quickly they fell on their ass. Not that the tree folk was being aggressive, he was just looking somewhere new. Looking at me, actually, from a single glowing eye near the top of its trunk. As I got closer, that Dead Sea shipper put a wrapped bundle at the tree folk's base. They looked nervous as one of the branches curled down, but all the tree folk did was offer something back. Small, bumpy, like a miniature cantaloupe. I'm sure you can imagine. Voice in my head saying, "Hello, Dermot Klein," probably made me gasp. The Dead Sea shipper gave me a sympathetic look like they knew all about tree folk and I was the newbie who'd never seen one before. "Thought you'd be long gone by now," I said, letting that Dead Sea shipper think whatever they liked as they walked away. That deep voice rattling the base of my neck didn't hurt so much the second time. "Place is here now, today. Your home accommodates my roots." I'd noticed as I walked up, the tree folk sported 2 new legs, and all 5 split off into dozens of thinner shoots buried in the agribase's soil. Wouldn't have pegged the low market as more comfortable than the surface. When the tree folk didn't respond, I asked, "What was with your friend there?" "It is your kind's way to want, and want to be useful." Grunted and leaned forward to see what the Dead Sea shipper left behind. Just a bundle of wires, not even intact ones. Looked like someone pulled a bunch of old fiber optics from somewhere, frayed edges and all. Closer to its trunk, I saw sheets of titanium, intact circuit boards, crystal drives, and such. Most responded to my nanos, meaning this was usable tech, but the sort of damaged stuff that the G-Deck drones fed into the converters. While I watched, a branch hoisted one of those titanium sheets, sticking it into the massive vines on what I thought was its head, next to some bundles of dead wire, like decoration or armor. Anyone else try something stupid? No trembling this time. Instead of words, the tree folk sent me this feeling of security that reminded me of my grandmother's cottage outside Greater Forest number 12. A bunch of the upper branches extended toward the viewport as we reached peak hours for the solar collectors. Sun feels differently up there, eh? To which the tree folk said, "I am closer and without interference." Huh. I hadn't thought of it that way. "Can't remember if these charged slower on the surface," I said, holding up my nanos. "It's been a long time." "You are similar, but not identical, but close." "Meaning?" "Your skin tech is a symbiosis." I looked sidelong at its big glowing eye. "You're saying I photosynthesize?" And I swear the tree folk's leaves rustled like laughter at that one. Over the next bit, more people arrived with things for the tree folk. 1 or 2 looked like they'd been there before. I remember one little kid not wanting to go anywhere near the agribase until this tiny root poked up and made them giggle. Everything they brought was scrap, but each person walked away with a bumpy seed, bundle of leaves, or a tiny branch the tree folk dropped from a limb. My buddy had set up some sort of trading system, like the other vendors, but it seemed to me like it was getting the shaft in return. Held my tongue until this last vendor showed up. Young, swarthy, mop of hair on his head, wearing this bright gold coat to cover up his, let's call them rumpled clothes. Carried himself with that self-important swagger of the old Union, you know? When he held out what was obviously a burnt-out comm node that must have fallen behind a console, well, I'm sure you remember me stepping in. Don't worry, I promised this wasn't about you. After you left, I told the tree folk, no way this junk is worth pieces of yourself. We grow, change, replace. Nothing permanent given, I'm creating the permanent. What, like you're settling in? My place is here now. Not down there. I pointed out the window. Even in our low markets thermosphere lane, we didn't see much but clouds most days. Couldn't imagine a tree folk preferring that, even with the sun from the other direction. Your kind have the run of the forest these days, right? I got the sense that it hesitated a bit this time when it said, not forests, your forests. I thought I knew plenty about the old growth forests, or greater and lesser forests, like the UN called them. You might not remember when they were first cultivated, giving a bunch of the world back to nature and all that after the tree folk came out of hiding. It seemed to me like Earth was their oyster, or something that makes sense when you're talking about plants. Until the tree folk showed me a memory. Must have been its home in a forest with huge leafy trees and moss on every boulder. Some sort of flying squirrel jumping between branches looked like the sort of place my grandmother would have loved to hike. Until the tree folk shifted perspectives, I guess, showed me how it saw the forest, the difference between the old trees and the new ones, lab grown to speed up reforestation, planted not quite randomly by well-meaning humans. That flying squirrel's heart beating steady on account of its forebears living on nutrients in a preserve. Everything fitting together just so, like the low market and its matter energy converted parts. I remember saying, not exactly wild, is it? The tree folk didn't respond, but it didn't need to that time. I could imagine not feeling at home in that forest, wanting to try something new, even if that meant tucking dead wires into your branches and dealing with ogling vendors. Or at least I thought I could. Maybe I should have looked at those wires more closely, but in my defense, my buddy didn't tell me everything. Last time I saw the tree folk, you probably know where this is going. Low markets might be built with parts that fit together perfectly in space that isn't wasted, but that doesn't mean we take things for granted. Sensors all throughout are supposed to tell us when something goes haywire, fed directly to the link of whichever crew person is on duty that day. Yeah, lucky me. I noticed little anomalies in the days before, sort of thing that happens on any orbital, regardless of how its parts are made. Wires come loose, gravity nodes shift out of alignment, micro leaks need patching. They happen, but not almost 20 in 2 days. I was deciding who deserved more hell, the converter techs or the sensor techs, when a scrubber reported a blockage on B deck in one of the solar array's big transistors. An organic mass, of all things. Should have gone to the observation deck first, but I needed to see it to be sure. Humans are wired funny like that, right? The scrubber didn't have a camera, so I closed the power to that section and crawled my way there, or tried to anyway. Made it halfway before I found another blockage. This mottled dark brown root as thick as my forearm wound through one of the relays, leading right to the matter energy converters. I didn't have time to do more than curse before the orbital's imminent disaster alarms went off. Here's what I figured. The tree folk knew someone would notice its roots sooner or later. It must have grown them out carefully, used unimportant junctions, and masked them with the scrap it collected, like the ones I read about on my link, using our tech to help bring back the old growth. We'll never know now, but I have a feeling it knew when the scrubber reported the blockage. Maybe it even knew I'd have to go looking, which conveniently placed me as far from the observation deck as possible without going EVA. Not that I can prove anything, of course, since our final chat didn't last long. Security clearance got me to the observation deck despite the alarms. I heard shouts a couple of times coming from the direction of the airlock, so as far as everyone else knew, the alert was real. I didn't know any differently myself at the time. Blame it on that weird human wiring again. A month since I found it in that crawl space, the tree folk's root-covered knot head brushed the ceiling and its trunk and branches blocked half the viewport. Didn't make the light in there any less bright. Every solar panel outside hung open toward the sun. Normally we'd close half during peak hours. Opening all of them like the tree folk did collected more energy than the converters could ever use. My nanos recharged in seconds before activating a sheen to protect me from the excess. And all I hear in my head is one word: depart. Damn if that didn't give me a headache. What are you doing? I shouted over the alarms. The massive eyes stared down at me, and I felt like nothing. Not like an insect or a station rat, since those critters have a purpose. The tree folk stared at me like I didn't belong, and I'd be lying if I said I ever shook that feeling completely. It didn't stop me from asking, were they right? Was that freighter crew right about you? No. You sure? You are respirating. Which hadn't occurred to me. Whatever the tree folk wanted, it didn't include hurting anyone on the market or denying me oxygen. If it could control the alarms and reorient the solar collectors, someone in security got fired for that, I'm sure. It could shut off the oxygen or explode the station core without warning anyone. All those offerings, all that time spent worming its roots into the low market's guts, and the first thing it did was chase everyone away. And I needed to know why. The tree folk didn't have to tell me. Probably thought I wouldn't understand, but I did as soon as it showed me home. Not the greater forest from before, regardless of how hard its kind fought to protect and expand them. The tree folk showed me a forest that didn't follow any human pattern, our subtle rules in making the world just so. Showed me something completely natural, where everything's spontaneous and lives and dies by chance. No accelerated growth, no supplements, no selective breeding, the sort of home its kind knew a long time ago, which we never really gave back to them, even though we tried our best. This home wasn't on the surface, though. There was a shell around the outside. The crawl space, 6 decks of concourses, administrative levels, and docking ports might have been gone, but I knew the shape of my low market. The old promotional bids used to say the matter energy converters could produce anything, and the tree folk was about to prove them right. Except in what it showed me, I didn't see the tree folk itself. So I asked it, what happens to you? My place will be here. Okay, now hold on. And the last thing it said to me was, you should leave, Dermot Klein. Right then, my link warned me the temperature and radiation in the observation deck were almost past what my nanos could block. Something with the tree folk standing there alone didn't sit right with me. But what was I supposed to do? Waited until my nanos couldn't shield me anymore, and then I walked away. Now that the tree folk needed me at that point. I was the last one on the escape craft. Alice from security overrode some protocol to keep them from leaving me behind. By the time we circled the low market, every window glowed from inside, and the solar collectors pulsed in a way they're not supposed to. Expected the whole thing to come apart. Tree folks' plan couldn't possibly work, right? Except you know it did. Frankly, I'm surprised no one tried to retake the orbital or some such, demand reparations from the tree folk on the surface, whatever that would mean. Heard the UN sent a team, and when whatever being lives there now let them in to talk, they couldn't bring themselves to go further than the airlock. Paid off the company for the orbital, declared it a protected space. I guess we're not as much like the folks in my docudramas as an old cynic might think. If you've seen the stills from inside the market, even through the windows, I can't imagine wanting to touch it. They might have used our tech to come to creation, but it's a place no human has a right to tread. Which brings us back to you, Union Man. Don't need you to just know what happened. I want to make sure you understand it. Because that bumpy seed you're carrying in your pocket, my buddy might have handed those out, but that doesn't mean you all get to keep them. Consider it a tax, and one that isn't too hefty, if you ask me. Station rats and insects have a purpose, but so does a seed, and so do I. Now you best hand it over, and I'll go take it home. And that's that. Thanks very much. That was Seeds for Titanium.
I love the story, but I also loved your very conversational approach to delivery. It was just really a pleasure to listen to.
Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate that.
Really, really great work.
Thank you.
And as you may have noticed, we had a bit of technical difficulty getting started. Laura had a power outage. She's kind of back on deep background, but just on her phone. So I'm going to continue. And Brandon, you did get a chance to sort of self-promote a little bit. I'm looking at your bio here, and I'm just going to try and add a detail or two that you may have missed. You talked about your novel Catalyst, came out 2022. You did not mention that you have a sequel upcoming in 2025, which is awesome. Brandon also has best-selling TTRPG publications with Fat Goblin Games and We Are Legion, and he's contributed to the Story Engine and elsewhere. You did mention, Brandon, you're an organizer for CanCon in Ottawa, and a frequent TTRPG player. And yes, indeed, you wear a lot of hats. Your bio says too many, but I don't think so. I think you're doing just fine. You can find Brandon on Instagram or Blue Sky or at brandoncrilly.com. So, as is our custom, we're just going to pause for a moment between authors to just take a breath, let the last story resonate, and then just sort of be fresh and ready to give the next author, who is Katherine Quevedo, our full attention. So let's just all pause, take a breath, and now we're ready. So, Katherine Quevedo, our next author, was born and raised near Portland, Oregon, where she now works as an analyst and lives with her husband and 2 sons. Her fiction has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and appears in Nightmare Magazine, Fireside Magazine, On Spec, Factor 4 Magazine, Latine Lit, Heroic Fantasy Quarterly, and elsewhere. Her mini chapbook of poetry, The Inca Weaver's Tales, is available from Swords and Kettle Press, and you can find her at katherinequevedo.com. Katherine, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I have 2 stories for you tonight. The first one is called The Menagerie Machine, and this was first published in Short Editions Short Circuit. The Menagerie Machine. Zebra, mule, and I stood abreast, as always, and studied the newcomer. Seahorse reared up from his pale green tentacle of a tail. His upper half resembled the cavalry horses behind us, complete with kicking hooves and a spray of mane. Of all the carousel steeds, only Seahorse boasted such fine aquamarine paint, not our bland neutrals. From my spot behind the bench next to him, I strained to watch his half-laughing, half-snarling face and one of his silver eyes. He'd replaced Ostrich after she'd lost hope and decayed, but no one ever mentioned that, not even the cavalry horses. To speak of the circumstance that had brought him gave it too much power, made the memories of Ostrich real. Admiring Seahorse distracted me from the machine's 3 miseries. Endless circles during the day, motionlessness at night, and most of all, the cavalry horses. The dromedary, they called me, never camel. Mule claimed it was because we are jumpers and they are mere standers. Seahorse also bobbed up and down with us to the band organ, while the horses and bench stuck fast. Then Mule insisted I should bask in the compliment of their jealousy. I wondered if I should praise Seahorse using flattery disguised as jealousy. At least it would break our pattern. I gathered the courage one night after the plaza lights had darkened to make way for the stars. Distant branches around the perimeter rustled in a breeze. All else lay still, halted. Moonlight angled under our canopy, spilling over Seahorse's contours. His blue-green paint gleamed like a jewel. Imagine not having any trappings, I said. Seahorse's eye peered back at me in a silver flash. I clearly meant him. No tassels, no buckles, not even glass gems like the ones in Zebra's mane. Every other steed glittered with adornments, yet no other steed pulled off such stark magnificence as he did. The cavalry horses behind me snickered. The dromedary's blathering again, one said. Too bad her own tassels aren't enough to distract anyone from her drivel. Or her droopy face, said another. To my left, Mule stamped his hoof. To my right, Zebra closed her eyes and hummed the carousel song, as she did when agitated. Some days that song was a lullaby to me. Other days it was a dirge. Today it lingered in a strange disguise, as though in a different key. Tell them off, Mule said. He'd done so often enough, although they still called him an ass. Seahorse's gaze had chased my voice away. He thumped his tail against the platform. I'd never seen him move it before without the machine's assistance. Zebra stopped humming but kept her eyes closed. Mule's tail flicked, but he said nothing. I think she offended the hippocampus, said the third horse behind me. Snickers followed. They always said the hippocampus, never Seahorse. No trappings at all, I said, forcing the rest out, but twice the splendor of all of us with our fineries. Seahorse's eye opened wider. Why wouldn't he turn around? I hoped it was just shyness, that he recognized my compliment for what it was. The stargazer sure aims high, the central horse behind me said. Stargazer, that was a new one. While zebra and mule's heads faced straight ahead, only my neck was carved to curve upward. The three horses burst into snickering. Between that all too familiar noise and Seahorse's cryptic gaze, I longed to close my eyes and hum the carousel song like zebra, feigning some sort of escape. But those horses would always follow me, inescapable, laughing. I glanced at the crescent moon visible under the canopy's edge. It resembled the bottom of one of Seahorse's hooves. I wished it could come down and kick those horses, but alas, it had its own pattern to follow, with even less chance to break it than I could mine. Why would the hippocampus care what she thinks? The central horse said. His name is Seahorse, I blurted. Yes, and mine isn't one of the cavalry horses, she replied. I gritted my teeth. She had a point. How could I criticize her for refusing to use our names when I didn't bother to know hers? I pivoted on my pole and stretched my long neck toward her and the other horses. I'd viewed them sideways plenty of times, but never straight on before. Their wide-spaced eyes glared at me from their bridles and filled me with competing emotions, just as when the machine wound down to a standstill each evening. Annoyance at disruption from a pattern, relief that the repetitiveness had ended at last, and a buried fear that the familiarity might never resume. How would you like to be addressed? I asked. She snorted. Not by the likes of you. I inhaled to calm myself. That's when I noticed the stench. I leaned in as close as I could and sniffed deeply. An odor of staleness and grime bit into my nostrils. Decay, like ostrich. Just as I thought, I mumbled. The horses looked scandalized, too proud to ask me what I meant, but desperate to hear my conclusion. You're so used to your own smell, I said, as tenderly as I wished them to treat me. We don't even notice it, but it's clear to us. I glanced toward zebra, mule, and seahorse. Then I turned back. But we can put up with it for as long as we have to. We'd outlast them, after all. I hoped my friends didn't mind my speaking for them. I spun back into place and waited for the horses' insults. They sniffed together, but without their usual self-importance. It came softly, an embarrassed sound. I risked a peek back. They hung their heads with their eyes and, for once, mouths closed. I wondered if this was peace. No, this was silence and stillness. We'd still keep spinning and stopping, spinning and stopping. Whether we moved or stood still, we went nowhere. My stargazing head lowered. But then I noticed Mule tossing his mane in approval of me getting the better of the horses. Zebra whinnied giddily. Seahorse turned his romance side to me, the side facing out to the plaza, the more decorated side, or in this case, the one that would have had more ornamentation if he'd had any to begin with. And I spotted it. On the edge of his otherwise plain saddle, a small mirror glinted in the shape of a star. The reflection of my eye, with long painted lashes, peered back at me. I was a stargazer indeed. I took advantage of my long neck once more to gaze at him as I turned my romance side to him. I lined up my own side mirror, a thick crescent like tonight's moon, with his star. I like to think that our mirrors reflecting into each other formed an endless straight corridor that led us, in our minds at least, somewhere beyond the confines of the machine, freedom in our own night sky. His half snarl turned into a full smile. I knew he felt the connection and, bliss of all bliss, progress as well. Who would have thought our trappings would provide temporary escape? Suddenly, alternating between bobbing in circles and being stuck in place no longer vexed me. We had a third option, and it was ours to choose. This was peace. Now I will shift to my second story. I'm going to read Song of the Balsa Wood Bird, and this was first published in Fireside magazine. And just a quick content warning, this has a brief reference to parental death in the story. Song of the Balsa Wood Bird. I followed my mother through the open-air market, weaving between stalls of wallets, pan flutes, and knitted ponchos in crayon garish colors. Tourist sunblock and perfume overpowered the stink of fresh leather from the stalls. I inhaled those foreign scents, let their promises of escape permeate my lungs and quicken my heart. They conjured distant cities, those aromas, with more skyscrapers than colonial facades. A million different futures for my teenage self. But for now, my mother and I sought gifts for my cousins abroad, trinkets for their college dorms. Llamas were all the rage over there, they claimed, but they wanted authentic ones. A table of animal figurines caught my eye. The seller, a tiny woman with 2 long braids, leapt from her stool and greeted me with the customary "A la orden," at your service. Wrinkles gathered upon her face like tree rings. I gave her a quick smile, then examined her merchandise. In one row stood animals made of stone, and in another of tawan nut. Behind those rested bright creatures of painted balsa wood, light as corks, nice and inexpensive to ship. I didn't notice any llamas, but I spotted a curious bird-like creature carved with the plumage of a macaw, the great scaly feet of an iguana, and the long neck and beady eyes of a tortoise. But its beak, its beak, majestic curvature to rival that of a toucan in flame orange. I'd never seen such vivid, shimmering paint. When my mother looked back to find me studying it, she clucked her tongue. Alondra, that's not what your cousins want. They always got what they wanted. She turned to leave. When I didn't follow, she paused. Looks like you found a knick-knack for your own dormitory, and only 5 years early. I blushed. My mother attempted to barter the woman's price down, as expected for us natives, but the seller scowled, and somehow those wrinkles deepened. No haggling for this little bird. She'd charge us a foreigner's price, which only made me covet the sculpture more. I clutched my mother's arm, begging her with my eyes not to insult this woman. My mother sighed and opened her purse. I'd guessed the carving was of Quetzalcoatl from the Aztecs or Maya or some other culture way up north. But back at the house, my abuelo took it in his leathered hands and, upon examination, declared it none other than Etza, ruler of all birds. The name seemed familiar, probably from an old school lesson, but my recollection ended there. Ruler of birds? I asked. Abuelo shot my mother a disappointed look. Have we grown so far from the jungle that we can't bring a bit of it with us? She pretended not to hear him and went out back to tend the avocado tree. He continued, according to legend, a demon named Iwia terrorized the rainforest. He orphaned an infant named Etza, deceived the young boy, and raised him as his own. Poor Etza had to go hunt birds each day to bring for Iwia's dessert. Ew, I squirmed. He stifled a grin. The rainforest grew quieter, less colorful without the birds. Then one day, Etza befriended a dove who told him the truth about Iwia being a demon and having killed his parents. Etza also learned he could bring the birds back if he blew their feathers through his blowgun. Abuelo perched the wooden figurine in his palm, fingers open and non-threatening, as if he held a live creature. The part of the legend you don't often hear is that when Etza freed the birds from the demon, the boy was transformed into this shape as a reward to escape the sadness of his past. They gave him this magnificent beak to signify the tube he'd used to save them. They say it produces the most superlative bird song of all because it carries the gratitude of every bird species of that jungle. My pulse rushed at the thought. I desired nothing more than to hear it, that song of escape, of freedom. That night, I placed the figurine next to my pillow and stared at it in the humid, sweaty dark. Please, Etza, I whispered, let me hear your song. The beak gleamed back at me, as still and silent as I imagined the rainforest must have been without all its birds. My heart sank. I knew too well that feeling of a place being devoid of something missing. Whenever the topic of my future came up, I could see the resignation my mother tried to hide from her eyes, even as she talked about college, as if the demon Iwia had gobbled not just the birds from the jungle, but also the wealth and opportunity from around us. I didn't want that resignation to creep into me. What would it take to restore greatness, to make real change? Only once, I pleaded. The carving moved. I bolted upright, gripping the bedsheet. I fumbled for the light switch, my eyes never leaving the figurine. As light flooded the room, Etza stretched his wings and neck. They rippled with iridescence. He blinked at me with eyes as dark and precious as black coral. Finally, he opened his beak. The birdsong trilled against my eardrums, channeling his memories straight into my mind. I saw the human Etza surrounded by trees, so many branches waiting to be perches again. I watched him lift his blowgun to his lips to make it more instrument than weapon. And out from the wooden tube streamed thousands of birds, over 100 types of hummingbirds alone, plus macaws, toucans, motmots, tanagers, and curassows. They warbled and trumpeted and chirped. The foliage trembled with their song. They fluttered and soared and dashed to freedom, sparkling like gemstones spilling across the green fabric of the rainforest. My eyes blurred with tears from the beauty, from the emotions, Etza's and the birds, that their song carried. Notes of gratitude, as Abuelo had promised, but also of sadness and of regret that things had reached this point. When the song ended, I found myself weeping into my bedsheet, my hair plastered to my forehead and neck. The figurine had become motionless balsa wood once again, the best kind of wood for Etza, weightless like a bird's bones, taking up space with the type of presence reserved only for taking flight. I took that figurine with me when I followed in my cousin's footsteps to college abroad, as my mother had predicted. I took it with me afterward, too, through my studies and travels, in my backpack for every hike, on my desk where I work now designing green infrastructure, always keeping a bit of the jungle with me. True to my word, I never asked Etza to sing again. When you hear something that powerful and listen with an open heart, you never have to. You've already been transformed. Thank you. Daniel, you're muted.
I was muted. Thank you so much, Catherine. I loved both of those stories very much. Really, really lovely work. Katherine Quevedo, folks, and our first author, Brandon Crilly. You know, we don't try and create any kind of coherent programs with our authors. We just sort of match people together in kind of a serendipitous way. And these stories and authors were very different tonight, but there was something very satisfying about the cohesion of the program tonight. It's ineffable. I really couldn't tell you exactly what, but really lovely program. Both of you, thank you so much. And come on back anytime. So thank you all for joining us once again. Another story hour. And please come on back next week when our authors will be Justin C. Key, and Patrick Barb. I want to thank my fabulous co-host, Laura Blackwell, or as I refer to her, 2023 Shirley Jackson Award finalist, Laura Blackwell. And thanks again to our authors, Brandon Crilly, Katherine Quevedo,